So the areas we're going to look at is we're going to talk about resolution considerations and impact on auto resize, anchoring, things like orientation, what impact they can have. We'll also look at some of the tools FileMaker provides us with to help us in building our app as quickly as possible. One of the key gotchas that we definitely came across when we were doing initial testing for the first time, and a look at what graphic requirements and considerations there are when building our iOS application. So to start with, let's talk about resolution. In regards to iPhone, there are actually 4 different resolutions currently available. And that's for iPhone 4, generally and below. Then we've got the 5, 6, and finally the 6 Plus, which you can see on screen here. If we have then, of course, talk about landscape, technically that becomes 8, just for the iPhone itself. And what I've tried to do is highlight some of the resolutions we've got here. When the iPhone is in portrait mode, we also have a 20-point header area, which is going to be for where the clock and the cell info is, although this does disappear if you go into landscape mode, but that needs to be taken into consideration. And then if we base the fact that our app is probably going to run full screen without menus and toolbars, then we've got the rest of the real estate to work with in that. Of course, this doesn't mean that you necessarily have to design 4 separate screens. For example, if we were doing an app just for for iPhone portrait, because we do have auto resizing and stretching, and so what you can do is you could maybe design for the smallest and have it stretch all the way out, utilizing the anchor points within FileMaker. What we've tended to do, though, is we found that actually designing 2 works really well. So if you design for the 4, it stretches quite nicely to the 5. And if you design for the 6, it stretches nicely for a 6 Plus. And the advantage to that is it gives you more real estate that you can design your app in as well, giving more functionality to the user. You also notice the word zoomed on some of those as well. The iOS 9 gives us on iPhone 6 and 6 Plus a zoom option that users can do. What that does, it takes a 6 Plus down to the resolution of a 6 and a 6 down to the resolution of a 5. So those are just some of the considerations that you want to keep in mind there as well. Then moving on to iPad, things are a little simpler. We have the 12.9-inch iPad Pro, which is our big one on the right there, and all other iPads pretty much fit into the same resolution of 1024 by 768, and that includes the Mini through to iPad Airs, etc., based on Retina resolution. So I also mentioned that FileMaker offers us some great tools in helping us to build our solutions. And whilst we're not going to talk about building an actual FileMaker database, I thought it worth mentioning some of those tools, particularly in the scripting workspace that FileMaker does give us in building our applications. So some of the first ones are things like being able to determine what system platform is, device, screen heights, and orientations. So the difference between system, platform, and device is the system is going to tell us whether it's Mac, Windows, iOS, or WebDirect. And then once we've grabbed the fact that we're on iOS, the device is going to tell us, for example, whether it's iPad or iPhone, as well as a few other things such as Android and Windows and Mac as well. So with a combination of both of those functions in a startup script, for example, we can steer the users to the right layouts and really kind of determine where the user's going to land up. We've also then got screen height and width, which is going to return a point value. Now, this, again, could be useful if we know we're on iOS, we know we're on iPhone. Being able to determine height and width can tell us which of those 4 different resolutions we're looking at, and maybe, again, switch the user based on screens. Now, you could say, well, why do we need window orientation if we've got screen height and width? Because that obviously will tell us which one's wider and therefore whether we're in portrait or landscape mode. But the orientation also will give us functionality such as, are we in upside down portrait mode, and are we in left or right landscape as well. So if that's important to you, that can be quite a useful feature. We've then got some functions that we might want to consider when we're looking at our app. Now, when we're working with FileMaker and FileMaker Go, we might want to leave things like the toolbars and the menu bars on the screen so we can change between files, we can use some of the built-in FileMaker functionality. But when we're building an actual iOS app, we're probably going to want to hide those out the way, lock them so the user can't get to them, and just completely control our environment for our application for the user. And that, of course, goes through to the zoom level as well. If we don't lock that at 100%, it would allow the user to pinch on the screen to zoom in and out. And again, that could be useful in certain areas, but a lot of the time that's probably going to actually hamper the user experience, so you're going to want to lock that off so that we have a really nice controlled environment. And then finally, there's a function called set allowed orientation. And you might, for example, want to build an app that only works in portrait mode or only works in landscape mode. So this, again, if you set it in a startup script, will allow you to control which of those modes can be turned on or off with a Boolean variable. And I'll show you a little bit of that in the demo itself. And then finally, not really script workspace, this is a layout trigger. There is something called onLayout size change. Great function. What this means is if somebody rotated the phone, that would run a trigger that we could then change these to a different layout, we could refresh objects, we could do all sorts of kind of things. So it really helps in being able to deliver a great experience within our application. So let's look at some of the considerations we need to think about when we're building an app rather than a FileMaker Go solution. And one of the first things is about closing the file. So if you've got a FileMaker Go solution and it's open on your phone, you've probably got the menu bar available, or maybe you put some buttons in there to close the file so you can swap in and out. Because with an application, you don't have a close file button, because the way a user would come out of an app is they press the home button on their iOS device. If, of course, though, when you're doing testing in Go, you don't put a close button in, this is definitely going to catch you out, because you can't then close that file. You've probably got to either delete FileMaker Go off your phone or go in and remove that through iTunes or something like that. So that's definitely a gotcha to watch out for. So it's worth putting a little close button in there just for testing in the initial stages when you're working in Go. But of course, don't forget to remove it before you go live with your application. So then on to graphics as well. You also want to think about how your graphics will stretch and work with different resolutions. Of course, FileMaker supports SVG as a format now. It's still not a widely used format, but it's becoming more so. Scalable vector graphics, they're resolution independent, and they will scale beautifully. These are the icons that are built into FileMaker now, are SVG, so they work really nicely. But if you've got background graphics or logos, you might want to think, if you are stretching those, how they're going to look when they stretch. This is particularly true if you're using any web viewers within your application as well. Particularly with a background graphic, they're not necessarily going to stretch or refresh well. And one of the apps I'm going to show you a brief look at the end of the demo is something where we had to do that. So what we did was we designed the screen that had the web viewer on for every single resolution, so we could control that entirely. And then once we went behind that, we got into just native FileMaker functionality. We kept it to 2 different screens, which stretched up to the larger one as well. So that's something worth thinking about. Something else you're going to want to look at, which is beyond your typical FileMaker Go, is some of the graphics you're going to need to create to turn it into an application, such as an app icon for the home screen, launch images and obscure icons. We'll talk a bit about what they are and how they fit into the schema when we come to the demo. But once you become a registered Apple developer, the iOS human interface guidelines that are available on Apple's website are extremely useful. They go into a lot of the details about resolutions, what's required, what's not required, and that's a great resource to take into account as well. The next thing to think about is updates. When we're working with a FileMaker Go file or a FileMaker database, we're all used to having complete control of the environment. However, when you're putting an app out in the App Store, for example, you put version 1 out, you put version 2 out. Version 2, in essence, would overwrite version 1. So a user potentially is going to lose their data. And FileMaker doesn't really support data migration between versions. In fact, when you read the documentation in the iOS SDK, it talks about that. But that doesn't mean we can't do it. So it is possible. It requires a little bit of programming, a little bit of thought in advance about how you're going to do this. I said I wasn't going to get too techy, but I just want to briefly mention this. I think it's worth talking about, just so that everybody's aware that this is possible. By working with creating your actual FileMaker database, the data file itself, giving that a version number, and then there's something called an always overwrite flag in the config file, which will show you. It sounds technical, it's not. I'm going to show you that in the demo, and how we can utilize that to create versioning, and then we could actually support updates We won't lose the client's data, the end user's data, and we can bring that data forward into new versions as well. So it is possible. I'm not going to go through that in complete detail. Maybe we'll save that for another webinar as well. And now moving on to some of the tools that we need to build our FileMaker app solution. So to start with, we're going to want the iOS app SDK. It's available from FileMaker. If you're a registered FileMaker developer within the FileMaker development community online, it's a free of charge tool that you can download. And that's something we're going to be working together with in the demo today. The next thing you're going to want to do is enroll in the Apple Developer Program. Now, this does have a charge. It's $99 a year. It requires an Apple ID. This is probably the same one you would log into your iTunes with. And if you're going to register as a business rather than an individual, then you'll also need something called a DUNS number. This is something that it's an ID from Dun & Bradstreet. It's free of charge. It takes a couple of weeks to get, and it allows businesses to verify you as a company. It's quite an easy process. You can do it all online. Once you've got your DUNS number, you can then put that into your application for the Apple Developer Program, and normally that will take a few weeks. Then you'll have a whole portal that will open up online, and this is where we create our app IDs. And it gives us access to a whole host of other tools. One of which is the final thing we're going to talk about, which is Xcode. Again, this is a free of charge tool available from Apple once you're a registered developer. And that downloads onto your desktop, and this is the tool we're going to be working with today. And it's what the iOS app SDK from FileMaker integrates with to help us build our application. And once we've got our Apple ID, you put that into Xcode in the preferences, and it ties the whole thing together and links it to your Apple Developer Program. Of course, if you're Apple developer, you're an end user, and you're a developer, then your developer's probably going to do all this for you. And this is a process, for example, that we've already been through for some of our clients. So one of the things I wanted to just touch on briefly, getting away from the techie for a second, was when you're thinking about what would FileMaker be good at or not good at when it comes to actually building an app. Because not necessarily every app is going to be perfectly suited to a FileMaker environment. For example, this might seem a little obvious, but building a game in FileMaker Go, probably not the way you want to go. Fitness apps, things like social media, stuff like that is really not really suited probably to FileMaker. But anything that is data related, working in a business-to-business environment, business management frameworks, these are the sort of things that are going to be really well suited to a FileMaker Go iOS app. Also, one of the things to think about, and this is something that we've talked to people before about, is using FileMaker Go as a rapid prototyping tool, then to scale up to a full-blown iOS app if that's something you wanted to take advantage of later on. Because building that in the first place could be very expensive, could be very costly in time, whereas FileMaker Go is going to allow you to build that very quickly. And then you could put that out to market, do market research, test with that before committing to a larger expense, potentially. So putting some of those tools into context, what's the workflow that we'll go through? Well, to start with, you're going to build your FileMaker solution, probably using something like FileMaker Pro Advanced. You're then going to want to test that. Again, the easiest way to test that is with FileMaker Go to start with. You can test it probably on the iPhones or iPads you already have in your office or that your developers are using. We're then going to start using Xcode, which is our tool from Apple, and work with the iOS SDK. And we're going to compile that, and that's the brief demo we're going to go through, and I'm going to show you how simple that can really be in enabling us to build something very quickly. And within Xcode, one of the nice features of that is it has simulators for every iOS device available. So you might not necessarily have 6+ phones, for example, in your office, but with the simulator you can test it in that environment as well. And then finally, you can deploy and test onto real iPhones, and there's a multitude of ways that we can deploy, and we'll briefly touch on that. But as Mark mentioned earlier, we're going to kind of save deployment for another webinar. And of course, at any point, you can go back through an iterative development cycle of building, testing, debugging, until you're finally ready to deploy. So before we get into the demo, I'm just going to talk about what it is we need to do from a configuration point of view. So there's a few things we need to configure in our Apple Developer Portal. Namely, when we log in, we need to create an app ID. So once we've created our Apple developer account, we're going to log on to the website, and we're going to create an app ID, and then we're going to configure various settings for what that app can do. And this is a brief look at what that is. So hopefully you can see that on the screen. On the left-hand side, we've logged into our developer portal, we've selected app IDs, we've created a new app and given it a name, and then we're going to give it an app identifier, which is unique. And then we're also going to set some things up down the bottom, which is our application services. There's 2 application services that we need to turn on by default. These are minimum requirements for FileMaker. One of those is data protection, and the other one is iCloud. You'll also note that things like Game Center and in-app purchases were highlighted on that screen, if you could see that. These are on by default within the Apple environment, can't be disabled. It doesn't mean we're about to start using the Game Center within our FileMaker Go application. And once we've done those, we also create our provisioning profiles online, and then once we go into Xcode and assign our ID, it's going to automatically pull those provisioning profiles down into Xcode for us, and that's where we pick it up and we switch over to our demo. Okay, so if you bear with me 1 second, hide that, and you can hopefully see my desktop now. And we've got some of the tools we're going to be using down here. And then here we have a folder with our SDK already downloaded. And this is the SDK that comes down from FileMaker. All I've done is I've expanded that, and that's created this folder here with some resources in it. Okay. So first of all, we've got a database. It's a FileMaker database. This is the contacts file that's created through the starter solution from FileMaker. Just wanted to keep it simple to show you. So I'm just going to open that up, bring that over here. Let's say this is the FileMaker starter solution. And we've got some layouts in here for iPad and iPhone. And when we go into the script workspace, you'll see we've got our on startup script for on first window open. And FileMaker's already got some scripts in here. So we're grabbing the system platform we talked about, and we're getting the device so we know whether it's tablet or iPhone down here. And then the script is then going to say, if we're a phone, go to the phone layout. If we're on tablet, go to the iPad layout. You can also see down here, system platform 3 is the equivalent of iOS. And there's already some scripts in here as well by default, which is show hide toolbars, set the zoom level. So what we're going to do is we're just going to lock that one, and I'm going to add some one extra line in here, and we're going to hide the menu bar as well. So show hide menu bar, and we're going to hide that, and we're going to lock that off as well. And just to remind everybody, the menu bar is the one that's going to be at the top of the screen in FileMaker Go, the tool, which is where things like close and launch and searches. And the toolbar is the one that's at the bottom of the screen, which is navigation, new record, things like that as well. This is also where you could put in the command we mentioned earlier about set allowed orientation. And we can choose whether we want portrait or landscape. So if, for example, we didn't want landscape to work, even if the user rotates their phone into landscape, the application itself won't rotate if we've got that turned on. But we're not going to use that for ours. We're just going to kind of lock everything off. So we're going to save that. We're going to close that. That's the only work we're going to do in FileMaker Pro. So we'll close our database. And we'll come back, and we've got this here. Now, the next bit we have to do is actually in the terminal. Now, there's only really 2 command lines we're going to need to type in our terminal, so it doesn't get too scary, hopefully. And the first one is we want to change our directory. And the nice thing about the Apple OS is we can just drag that in here. It's going to type that in. So all we've done is we've told the terminal to go to this directory we've got up here, the iOS app SDK, so that when we run our next command, it's going to run this mini little application, command line application, to do some work for us. And this is really one of the beauties of the FileMaker SDK. Technically, you could do all this yourself. This is going to save us hours of development time and work in building that for us. So let me just show you the command we now need to type. So typing and talking at the same time is not my strong suit, so I'm just going to try and not make any typos. So make project directory, which is this command here. The next thing we want to do is tell it what new directory we want to put our application into. So we're going to call that My Contacts App. Then we need to tell it the name of our application that we want to build. So we're going to call it My Contacts. And finally, one of the things we did online when we were setting up our app ID is we set up a bundle identifier. And I'm just going to type that in here. And in essence, it works out as a reverse domain is kind of the way to think of it. So we've got com.linearblue.mycontacts. Okay, so we've got the command we want to run, the application directory we want to put things in, the name of our app, and then the bundle identifier here. Okay, so I'm just going to create that. And when I run this, you'll see that a directory should start appearing automatically, and this will take just a couple of seconds. So there it is. Make Contacts app is already created. It's still running. A couple of seconds. This should finish. There we go. It's done. We can quit the terminal. That's all we need to do there. Okay, and there's our new application folder. And if we open that up, you can see we've got a whole bunch of stuff that's already built, including the Xcode project. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to run the Xcode project. We're just going to double-click on that. It's going to launch Xcode. And because this is basically a project in its own right, the security is going to kick in and say, hang on, this is the first time I've opened it. Are you sure you want to do this? Yep, I think I trust it. And it's now going to open up into Xcode. Now, for people who aren't too technical, the nice thing is this is not too scary. We're going to walk through this. We're not going to really be writing any code. It's all pretty much point and click. So you can see we've got our application on the left here, My Contacts. We're going to drill down into that. And the only area we really need to work in is the custom application resources directory. So we're going to drill down into that. And then in solutions files, when we drill down, you'll see the FileMaker SDK has already put some placeholders in for us, which is fantastic. So I'm just going to shrink that over a little bit so we can get to my database. So all we need to do now is we just drag our FileMaker database into our solution files. Now this is also the area where if we were talking about version control, we'd probably want to do something like that and put a version number on it so that when we do finally come out with some great new features in V2 of our app, we've got a way of migrating that data across. So we're not going to really go into too much detail of how to do that. Maybe we'll save that for another webinar. So we've got our database. We can click and drag that up into here. That's now copied that into our solutions directory, and if we actually drill down into our app itself, you'll see it's copied that in. And then we can go back into Xcode, and we can just delete the placeholder file and move that to the trash. Okay, so we've got Contacts 01 inside our application now, so that's great. Next thing we need to do is just go into the config file, and there's three things we need to think about in here. The first is the name of the launcher solution. So this is going to be the name of your FileMaker database that we've got over here on the left. Thing to remember is it is case sensitive. So when we're typing it, we want to make sure the case is identical to the name of the file that we have over here. If we were going to work with a help URL for directory helps, then we could put that in here. I'm going to leave that blank for now, so we're not going to use that. And the final thing down here is the always overwrite flag. Okay, now by default that's going to be on 0, and when you launch your app, absolutely you want to make 100% sure that that is on 0. What that means is, and the way this works, and again this comes down to the version control, is when a user runs this app for the very first time, what's going to happen is this Contacts 01 database is going to copy down into a reserved document space within our application on the user's phone. And it's going to run, and that's where they're going to start entering data. Now, if we had this set to 1, every single time the user opened the app, it would copy that file back out of itself to the documents area, overwriting their data every single time. So making sure that's on 0 is vitally important. That said, one of the things I'm about to do is set it to 1 just for the demo, because when you're doing testing, if you're maybe making adjustments to the file, and because I've already run this once this morning, it will not overwrite, so you won't see the changes. So when you're doing testing, you might want to think about putting it on 1. So when you do changes, they will be seen in your new rev. But as I said, it's vitally important you set that back to 0 before you compile for go live. Okay. And the next area we need to look at then is our graphics. So I mentioned 3 things earlier on, which was app icons, launch image, and obscure icon. And if we click on these, I'm just going to zoom this back out. Again, FileMaker's helped us by putting some placeholders in for some of the key graphics we want to think about. And app icon is probably the most obvious of the 3 here. This is going to be the icon that appears on the home screen on your iOS device, which is going to be the application. icon for launching. So we've got different resolutions here for different Retina screens, different sizes. Again, most of these are listed online, but for iPhone, for example, it's 120 pixels square for the 2x resolution and 180 for 3x for the larger screens. And then things like 76 and 152 for iPads, and then we've got iPad Pro over here at 167. But all of these are available within the human interface guidelines, and we'll probably post some of that information on our linear chat blog as well, if those that are interested in it from a technical point of view. So rather than having everybody sit here and watch me design graphics, which is very much not my strong suit as a developer, I've got a couple of amazing graphics I created earlier. And this will show you my graphic design skills now. So the nice thing is, just to get these in here, we don't have to do any command line programming. We can just drag and drop those in there. So we've got our iPhone ×2, our iPhone ×3, and we're going to drag some of these in here. We've got our iPad 1, iPad 2, and I'll just put the iPad Pro one in there as well. Now you notice these are square icons, and if you actually look at an iPhone, for example, you'll see that it has rounded corners. The iOS does that for you, so it's better to actually build your graphic, and in fact, again, if you go through the human interface guidelines, it recommends that you build it as a square, and then let the iOS round those corners for you, and it does it quite nicely. So moving on to the launch image, one of the things to think about here, the easiest way to think of the launch image is as a splash screen. So when the app opens for the very first time, while it's loading, you're going to see this launch image or splash screen on the screen for a few seconds. Again, you can design for different resolutions. There's options for universal. These are based on Retina screens, but you can also specify independent, actual individual ones as well if you want to get into iPhone, etc. If you leave any blank, the iOS, when it compiles, is going to automatically just scale those graphics up for you. So I didn't bother going through and putting all of these in. I'm just going to put number 1 in, and then I'm going to remove these out of here and let the iOS do the work. As you can see, I spent a lot of time building graphics here. An obscure icon, this one is probably easier to show you than to talk about, but when there's a couple of different times where this is going to come up. It's when the application is already open, it's running in the background. The easiest way to think about it is when you're on the home screen and you double tap your home button to go into multitask mode, I guess, to flick between your applications. This is the graphic that's going to appear on that screen. And because we're working with a database and secure data, it's called obscure icon because it's going to obscure the data so you can't kind of see it until you actually go into the application. So I've just done a very, very simple graphic here with a little padlock on it. This could be the size of your screen as well, and I can show you that in the real app we've done rather than the demo here as well. That just gives you an overview of some of the core graphics you're going to want to build and have available when you start building your application. Okay, so we're almost done. We just need to go into here, into My Contacts itself. This brings us to the overview page where we've got capabilities and resource tags in general. So you see there's the bundle identifier we mentioned earlier when we built our command line, when we used the SDK. This is where we'd also set up versions and build numbers which we were submitting. And this is also where we have to then go in and pick our team, which is linked to our actual Apple developer account. And this works with all the provisioning in the background. And I'll just briefly show you that in the preferences. So when we go into our Apple ID and we go into our team, we'll see some of our identifiers, and these are our provisioning profiles that allow us to provision testing devices locally as well. Okay, and one last thing we need to do in here within the capabilities is we need to scroll down, and we're going to want to turn on data protection in here because we're using data. We want to make sure it's secure and within our FileMaker environment. One of the things to mention as well when you're working through some of these capabilities is it's important to remember to only turn on functionalities you're going to use. So if, for example, you told Xcode that your app wanted access to the camera, but in your solution you don't actually use the camera, that is something that when you submit to Apple for approval on the App Store would be rejected because Apple says, okay, well, you say you want to use the camera, but you're not actually using the camera in your app, so we're going to reject based on that. So it's very important to just turn on the functionality you're really going to use within your application. And vice versa, if you're trying to grab pictures but you haven't enabled that, then that's not going to work either. Okay, so that's it. We've done all the configuration. We've set up our file. We've configured it. We've put the graphics in there. and we've turned on the settings we need. So we're ready to test this now. And we mentioned that Xcode has some great simulators built in. And at the top of the screen here, you can see we've got the app itself, and it says iPhone 6s Plus. If we click on that, we get a whole host of simulators that are already built in here. You can add more if they're not available. You can see we've got iPads, we've got iPhones. If my iPhone was also plugged in through a cable, we'd see that up here, and I could actually download it to my iPhone for testing as well, because it's been provisioned as part of my account. Let's just go into iPhone 6s now, and we can run this. We've got a run icon over here. We click that. Xcode is going to compile the application. It's going to build it, and then it's going to open the simulator on my machine. Build has succeeded. I'm just going to open that in the background, so let me just bring that to the foreground so you can see it's launching the app. There's our launch icon that we mentioned before, our launch graphic that's coming up because the first time the phone's loaded. And there we go. There's our database. We can scroll around. We can go back to list view. There's our 20-point header that we mentioned earlier with our carrier and clock. As you can see, we've got no menu bars. We've got no toolbars. It's a completely enclosed application. We can also go in here and we can do rotate left. We can see how that's going to work and how that's going to look. Let's go back and put that back in portrait mode. We can also go home. You can see we've got buttons here to go home. And there's our icon. There's the obscure icon as well. Sorry, let me go back in case you didn't see that. So top right-hand corner, you can see it's rounded off our icon nicely. We've got our app there now. It's running. We could see what that looked like on an iPad as well, if we wanted to go and look at different simulators. Also, if I press the home button twice, which I'm going to simulate now, you can see this is where the obscure icon came in. Also, you may have seen it flash up when we open the icon for a few seconds there as well. So you can kind of see how that looks. And that's it. So, I mean, let me just close that one down, show you what that would maybe look like on an iPad. Let's put that on an iPad here, perhaps. We can launch that up as well. And the nice thing is, even if the screen resolution is too big, you can scale it down so that it's not going to fit. You can work with it. There's the iPad, rotate left, etc. Okay, we've built an app. We're done. So I did also say I was going to just give you a brief look at a real app we're working on as well, just to kind of finish off the demo here. So I'm going to close that out now. I'm going to go back to the iPhone 6 and just open the simulator. It's the easiest way to get back into the simulator. So you see we've got something on here called Ditch My Car. This is a fun little app we're about to launch on the App Store in the coming months. It's an app aimed at showing you how much you could save on using alternative transport compared to owning a car. Say it's designed to be fun. It's probably going to be a free app that we're going to put out on the App Store. We launch it. You see we've got the launcher icons. Oh, I already had this open in the background, so let me just go back to the start screen. So this is a FileMaker Go app. This is actually a web viewer we've got running. You can see we've got background graphics, which we talked about. You can go into your car. You can swipe left and right to put various settings in as to if I did own a car, how much would I be spending on it? And then you could put trips in here and say, well, okay, I'd spend $25 on Uber, perhaps. Put that in there and see how much I've actually saved on my car. So it's only designed to be a little bit of fun. We can go in, we can see all of our list of things. We can filter down here and say, just show me items for a bus, etc. And we could email and export those details out if we want there as well. So that's what an app can look like if you spend a little bit more time on the interface. Say it's just something we're doing, which is a little bit of fun that we're getting out in the next month. And be more than welcome to download it and hopefully give us some feedback on that. Okay, so that's the end of the demo. I'm just going to drop back to the slides just for a few seconds, just to briefly touch on deployment. As we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we're not really going to go into too much detail, but I just wanted to touch on two of the key ways you can actually deploy your app, and then maybe we'll go into these in a lot more detail in future webinars. The first one is you don't necessarily have to actually go through the App Store to get your app out. So if this is an app that you're building for your business, for example, And rather than giving everybody FileMaker Go and then having them have files, but you want to actually deploy an app within your business, there is something called mobile device management, which will allow you to do that. And this can be, there are lots of tools out there. Some of them are free, some of them are paid, varying levels of functionality. Again, we could do a whole webinar just on MDM. And this allows you to provision a device with an app internally, allows you to distribute an app without going through the App Store itself and Apple. And it can work either where you completely control the device, or if it's a device that somebody has brought to work, it's their own device, then you can put a provisioning certificate on there just to, it's called a profile, just to support that one app where you can control that. So we don't really have time to go into that in any detail today. It's something we can look at in the future. And then, of course, the more obvious one is to submit it through Apple to the App Store, which is what we're going to be doing with Ditch My Car. And Apple gives us some great tools online, something called iTunes Connect, that when you become a registered developer, you get access to that. And that's where you submit your app. You can do testing through there. You can do beta testing. However, it will have to go through submission for Apple. They have to approve the app as well. And that tool gives us all the opportunities to set up pricing, localization, help, screenshots, things like that. Okay, so that kind of brings us to the end of the presentation. So I don't know if we've had any questions coming in whilst I've been talking. Hopefully it's given you something to think about from all sides. So let me have a look at this. So one of the questions come in is it possible to design an app using this method that connects to another kind of server different from FileMaker? So yeah, so let's just talk about that. Obviously, one way of designing the app is for it can be standalone, like the fun little thing we're doing at the moment, but in a more business environment, you probably want to connect to in some way to get that data out. So the obvious way is FileMaker Server, but the question was, is there a way of doing that to devices using, say, something like a REST API where we're maybe connecting to a web server, or connecting to other tools? And yes, that is absolutely possible. In the same way that it would be with FileMaker Go, you could code those settings into your app. URL commands are still available, so there's ways of getting data in and out on that, absolutely. Next question, is it possible to add code to the solution like another Objective-C code or Swift code? Yes, technically that is possible. In fact, I believe there are also some libraries already out there. Monkey Bread software, I think, is one that I've seen, is already out there. Yep, whilst FileMaker has put some nice helpful things in there saying, please don't mess with this folder. Of course you can do if you're technically competent. And so there are possibilities where you can do that and add things in there as well. Next question, will the webinar be available later on? Absolutely. Some point in the next week we're going to upload this definitely onto our linear chat blog. I think there was some talk about us maybe putting it onto a YouTube channel, so it will definitely be available online for people to look at and get information earlier. Someone also asked about iPod Touch. Sorry, I didn't mention that. In essence, you could read iPod Touch for iPhone. Anything that's available on the iPhone is available on the iPod Touch as well, and yes, that is completely supported. Next question. What have we got in here? Let's see. Do these apps behave like FileMaker Go? Yes, in essence, they are FileMaker Go. In a lot of respects, you do have to think about, some of the main differences are that, you're not working with multiple files, you're completely controlling the environment, and FileMaker have actually done a pretty good job of hiding FileMaker within the SDK. So once you get into the SDK, you build your app, unless you specifically put it in there, the word FileMaker isn't going to appear anywhere. And that's completely hidden, but in the way that the app works and uses, it is in essence a FileMaker Go app. Yeah. Are there any performance issues? Is it as fast as an application code in another technology such as Objective-C? And that's a difficult one to answer. I mean, in our experience, the apps we've built have been extremely fast. At the end of the day, the app is running locally. I think, as long as you take into consideration various areas when you're building the application, then yes, it pretty much can be as fast as you need it to be in the app we just talked about, and that's one of only several that we're working on. There is definitely no speed lags, there's no issues with speed, and everything is extremely responsive and extremely fast. Okay, so that's, can I build, one last one, can I build an iOS app with a Windows machine? As far as I'm aware, Xcode is an Apple-only environment. And obviously you're building for Apple-only devices, which is iOS. So to the best of my knowledge, no, I don't believe that you can build this on a Windows machine. Okay, well that's pretty much all the time I've got for questions. Please feel free to give us any feedback. We are going to have this up on our linear chat technical blog area as well. You can give us feedback, you can give us questions. We'll do our best to answer those as well. I don't know if Mark wanted to come back in here at the end, but thank you very much for attending, and hopefully this will be the first of many webinars in the future.